Hi, my name is Holly Cashman, and I am very pleased to be invited to moderate this panel this afternoon. And I invite my fellow panelists, if they would like to turn on their cameras, they may. I also want to thank the UNH LGBTQIA plus alumni affinity group, and you'll hear a little bit from the founder of that group after or towards the end of the panel. And I want to ask anyone who is attending, want to let you know, please feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A feature, and we will get to those within the last 15 minutes or so of the panel. But don't wait until then to put the questions in the Q&A. You can add them anytime during the panel. Before we get started, I would love to ask our three panelists to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about themselves, and then we will jump into some questions. Jordan, would you like to start?
Hi, I'm Jordan Edwards. I'm a sophomore at UNH, class of 27. I'm an environmental science major. I'm going for a philosophy minor. And I did an internship over the summer with Professor Cashman about LGBTQ plus history in the Seacoast, New Hampshire region.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jordan. We're so glad you're on the panel. Michael.
Hello, happy Monday from beautiful Washington, D.C. I'm Michael Labers. I'm the international news editor for the Washington Blade. We're the oldest LGBTQ newspaper in the United States. I am born and raised in New Hampshire. My hometown is Manchester. I graduated UNH in 2004 with a journalism and Spanish double major, and I've been at the Blade since May of 2012. The bulk of my work is reporting on, excuse me, reporting on LGBTQ issues abroad. And the last year I have been on assignment in Poland, Hungary, Germany, most recently Israel in October, and at the United Nations. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael, for being here. And last but not least, Linz.
Hi, all. My name is Linz Jake House. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the founder of 603 Equality, our statewide LGBTQ advocacy group. I don't have a personal connection to UNH, although I want to let folks know that our board president of 603 Equality is Denny Hatch, who teaches at the Paul College. So they're a great resource for folks on campus. And I have been working in progressive advocacy in New Hampshire for the last 10 years or so. And I live in Dover, and my pronouns are they, them.
Thank you so much, Linz, and all the panelists for your introductions. We're going to direct the first question to Jordan, who is representing the perspective of a current UNH student on the panel. Jordan, can you tell us how are LGBTQ plus students on campus feeling these days, in the wake of recent anti-trans legislation signed into law by Governor Sununu and the results of the recent presidential election?
I can say that a lot of LGBTQ plus students and even non-LGBTQ plus students, particularly allies, are feeling very stressed out and very dejected, particularly about the election results. A lot of people that I know, including myself personally, felt that we were making a lot of ground in the election, given like certain polls and stuff like that. And we're kind of hoping for a blue win for the country, and then of course then that happened. Um, in the days following the election, I noticed a lot of stress and a lot of like pessimism, particularly surrounding the future of LGBT students at UNH. Things like a lot of the diversity, equity, inclusion programs at UNH and other kind of things that occur on college campuses to help have support for trans and LGBTQ plus students in general. and worries about how access to those resources might change with the Trump administration. And it seems like these kinds of feelings aren't just unique to UNH students. Upon looking at data from the Trevor Project survey of over 18,000 LGBTQ plus youth, so ages 13 to 24, so that includes college students, about 90% of LGBTQ plus students said that their mental health had been severely impacted negatively by recent politics. That includes things like an election year, stresses about anti-trans legislation, or things that certain politicians have been saying. That being said, I don't want to just bring pessimism. It is really easy to help LGBTQ plus students feel a bit better, especially in the realm of mental health. For example, that same survey by the Trevor Project shows that if you just provide a welcoming community for LGBTQ plus students, the likelihood of them committing or attempting suicide like more than halves. So while mental health may be a growing concern, especially among LGBTQ plus students in the wake of the election and certain policies, I want to stress that it is actually quite easy to help LGBTQ plus friends by just making a more inclusive and welcoming space for them.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Um, Michael, you are connected with LGBTQ plus communities both in the US and around the world. And as you mentioned, have done reporting in lots of different countries in this past year and throughout your career. Um, where you live and work in DC, what are some of the things you're seeing kind of on the ground locally or hearing from communities you're in touch with outside of the country?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I was listening intently to what Jordan had just said, and I wrote down stressed and dejected is when Jordan was talking about how students at UNH are reacting. That's a very similar reaction to, it's very similar to what folks are feeling here in Washington. And I'll pull up a slideshow in a second, but I think, we're what, 13 days out from the election. There was real, folks here were pretty optimistic that Vice President Harris was going to win. The momentum seemed to be at her back after what was a very difficult summer with President Biden's decision to drop out. So that really gave folks renewed hope. And then all of that seemed to evaporate within hours. And here we are in Washington at the cusp of a second Trump administration. And it's really scary to folks here. We lived through the first Trump administration, and then we had the unrest in 2020. There was real concern leading up to the election with violence. And then we had January 6th here in Washington, which was very traumatic for folks who live here. I count myself among those. I was at the Capitol that day outside, and it was truly terrifying that these folks decided to come in and essentially invade our city. So folks were really, really concerned about that. Thankfully, there was no incidents of violence or anything, but who's to say, after January 20th, that's not going to continue. Folks are really concerned about that. And then here in Washington, we also have a unique situation with the fact that Congress has 30 days to review all DC council laws, our budget. We don't have congressional representation in Congress. So there's a real concern with with Republicans rather controlling the House and Senate and then the White House, that DC home rule really could be affected. And so there's real concern that we may lose even the little bit of autonomy that we in Washington have over our local affairs. So that's a real concern here. Looking at abroad, yeah, I think there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen here in the US once Trump takes office again. One of the things that I covered a lot at the Blade over the last 4 years is in 2021, Biden signed a memorandum that committed the US to promoting LGBTQ rights abroad as part of US foreign policy. it's far from ideal. We can talk all day long about how problematic US foreign policy is in general. But the LGBTQ specific component of that is something that folks, especially in countries where, for example, consensual same-sex sexual conduct is criminalized, really look to the US as an example for support and protection in many cases. And so there's real concern that when Trump comes to power, comes back to office on January 20th, that all of that is going to go away. So the folks that I speak with, by and large, around the world are quite concerned about what's coming down the road. So I'll try to pull up. I took a few photos just walking around Washington in the days leading up to the election. I'm going to try to pull those up and bear with me. I'm not the best at technology here, so let me see if I can do this. Okay. Can everybody see that? I think. So yeah, I'll just show, these are real quick. There's only 7 photos on here. The first one you see is I was at a Target in Northern Virginia about a week and a half before the election, and somebody lined up the coffee cups with that had letters on them and spelled Kamala. I thought that was really kind of cute, so I took a picture of that. This was DC has this annual like Halloween type event. It's the high heel race, so people literally run down the street in high heels. It's really fun. This is in my neighborhood actually. So this was the Tuesday before the election, and it was right after the vice president had her rally on the ellipse. There were 75,000 people down on the ellipse near the White House, and then a lot of them just walked up to DuPont Circle where I live. And so a lot of folks had Kamala Harris signs and pride flags, things like that. This was the day before the election, and this is Lafayette Square Park right in front of the White House. And you see the inauguration scaffolding. Those are reviewing stands. So that has nothing to do with the election per se, but reporters from all over the world were here covering the election. So this was the day before the election. And this is reminiscent to what happened here in 2020. A lot of businesses boarded up buildings, closed down because of the fear of unrest that started a few months earlier in 2020 when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis and the protests that happened here. This is a McDonald's near the White House. It's about a block from my office where I'm talking right now. So this was the day before the election, a coffee shop nearby. And this was the exception. There were maybe 5 or 6 buildings that decided to board up their windows, and then within a couple of days, they were taken back down. Just some Trump swag for sale, Pennsylvania Avenue and 17th Street. And you see this all over DC, regardless of who's in office, and somebody just decided to set that up. So, and this is the polling place in my neighborhood. This was election day. We had beautiful warm weather, so everybody was out voting. I personally voted early. We got the ballots in the mail a few weeks prior, so my husband and I voted early, but the line was down the block to vote, and this was about 8:30 in the morning on election day. So that gives you a little bit of what it was like here in Washington ahead of election day and then on election day itself.
Thank you so much for sharing both the kind of on the ground in DC perspective and also what you're hearing from your contacts around the world. Linz, at 603 Equality, you were tracking the anti-trans legislation that was proposed and then passed in New Hampshire, and kind of part of a national trend in 2023 and 2024. Could you tell us a bit more about what was passed and what was signed into law in New Hampshire, and maybe kind of what thoughts you have about what might be coming next with the election of Donald Trump and of Kelly Ayotte as governor?
Sure. And I've got about a 15-minute presentation, so I'll go ahead and share some slides. I know I'm a pretty visual learner, so it helps to see things written out. I want to acknowledge that this is just a really scary time for LGBTQ plus people, especially trans people, and especially the most vulnerable trans people, especially young people right now. Um, these are very scary, uncertain times, and we need to hold each other closer and show up for each other. And truthfully, we don't have all of the answers of where things are going. So I wanted to briefly share a little about, where we're at with the national state of LGBTQ rights, health, and safety, what we've seen locally in New Hampshire, make sure people understand the bans that were signed into law this summer, the overall goals of what I refer to as the MAGA movement, and then talk a little bit about how we can reframe things in terms of protecting our community. I'm sure folks joining this call or have some familiarity with the last couple of years being a record-breaking year for anti-trans legislation. More anti-trans legislation was introduced than any other year, calling and many national organizations like the Human Rights Campaign declared a state of emergency for LGBTQ plus people. Here in New Hampshire, we had 3 anti-trans bills that were signed into law last summer by Governor Sununu, who, of course, we know is decided not to run again. And now Kelly Ayotte is our New Hampshire's governor-elect. The first bill was HB 1205, which was a ban on trans girls participating in middle and high school sports with other girls. This had some really extreme language, or saying that any student who was unable to produce a birth certificate to quote unquote prove their gender could be asked to submit physical evidence verifying their gender, which harms not just trans girls, but all girls whose gender may be questioned. And we saw that this wasn't limited to just sports. There was another bill that Sununu signed that required 2 weeks notice for all LGBTQ plus curriculum in New Hampshire public schools. So that's anything from a piece of literature that was written by an LGBTQ author to history that covers LGBTQ plus people would require 2 weeks notice or in New Hampshire schools. And they also called it objectionable content, which is pretty demeaning. And then they passed New Hampshire's first anti-trans healthcare ban, banning some rare but medically necessary healthcare for trans girls under 18. And we knew that the strategy there on their end was to ban the thing that happens the most rarely, to or start to chip away at healthcare more broadly. And we expect to see more attempts to deny people the healthcare that they need. Overall, we know that one of the things that the MAGA movement did was they put out their playbook early on. So I'm sure folks have heard a bit, excuse me, about Project 2025, which basically seeks to legally define sex and gender in very narrow binary ways. Of course, or scientists who study sex, gender, biology know that it's actually much, much more complicated than or our opposition would have you believe. They want to erase federal and statewide non-discrimination protections. So in 2018, I was part of the campaign that made New Hampshire the 17th state at the time to update our non-discrimination law to include protections for transgender people, to say you cannot deny someone housing or deny them employment, fire them, refuse to hire them, or kick them out of a public space just because they are transgender. And at that time, a lot of people or across the political spectrum were really just starting to learn what it meant to be transgender, and were genuinely open to learning more. But I really see the when COVID hit and more conspiracy theories started emerging about public health, a lot of that really got our really started this fear-mongering campaign against what it is to be transgender, and started spreading a lot of lies and fears about us. Or not only do they want to repeal non-discrimination protections, but they also want to or allow adoption and foster services that work with LGBTQ people to refuse or working with us, attacking access to things like IVF, abortion care, silence more discussion about us in public schools and workplaces, and removing access to healthcare, including things like making a so-called conversion therapy legal again. I do want to share a little bit of good news. Some of this is paraphrased by a really great video from Chase Strangio, who's a trans lawyer who works with the ACLU, and he's about to argue a case on a healthcare ban for trans youth in Tennessee at the Supreme Court next this coming month in a few weeks. We don't know that exactly what the timeline is going to look like for state and federal actions. We expect them to do some of the more low-hanging fruit at the beginning, and not necessarily attack everything all at once. So we do have some time in some ways. And we can legally prepare now and plan for things like medical care, or helping each other access the care that we need and taking care of each other. So a lot of trans folks are making sure their IDs are updated. Right now in New Hampshire, GLAD and New Hampshire Legal Aid are able to help with the steps for that. Um, the first thing that we can do is to pitch in and help each other when a trans person that we know and love can I'm seeing folks post on social media like, I'm a notary, I'm happy to notarize legal documents for trans folks for free, or pitching in funds for a name change, things like that. We want to be able to take care of each other, and sometimes it can feel really lonely and isolating for trans people to take care of ourselves and each other. But we can look to our history as LGBTQ folks, and things that have happened before, when we found care within our communities. And we can also do things like, driving each other to an appointment if folks have to go to Vermont or Maine, for example, for care, or there are resources to help with that. Some challenges ahead. This Supreme Court case, the Skrmetti case, is a case concerning an access to healthcare for trans youth in Tennessee. Tennessee has banned gender affirming care like puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy for a specific demographic, trans youth, while allowing the same treatments for cisgender youth. So, for example, or cisgender, aka non-transgender, young people who go through puberty too early will sometimes be prescribed puberty blockers, or because they're not ready to go through puberty at like 8, 9 years old, for example. And that has not been attacked for them. But the state of Tennessee has banned that exact same treatment. So that's a clear discrimination issue for us. And it can, if the Supreme Court did rule to allow the state of Tennessee to keep its ban in place, that could put at risk everyone's access to healthcare, way beyond just gender affirming care. So it's really about a huge government overreach in terms of regulating healthcare, which we know is best left to patients and doctors that they trust. We know that we're going to be fighting at both the state and federal level. We have a lot. We are starting to track. We don't know all of the bills that are going to be introduced on the state level, although we have seen some bill titles that are available on the general court website right now. So we know that, for example, a so-called parental bill of rights has been introduced again, which they claim is about parents' rights, but is really about forcing the school to forcibly out transgender students, which we've seen introduced the last several years in New Hampshire. We're also seeing bills proposed that would do away with an X gender marker like I have on my driver's license, and say that New Hampshire can only offer male or female gender markers on driver's licenses. We're seeing another bill that would or remove New Hampshire's law against discrimination from including transgender people. We're seeing a healthcare attacks that say that or medical professionals can refuse care or if they don't support transgender folks themselves, and some other vague bills that we're not really sure what they mean regarding in healthcare that we're keeping an eye on. And so we really need to keep expanding and deepening support, or it can't just continue to be the couple hundred people that show up at the state house all the time to testify and to rally and to call their representatives and senators. We really need to be creating a wider circle of support for people that are showing up to take both political action and then to also just help each other access whatever we need outside of the system. So we need to keep talking to those people in our own lives. I think about the spectrum of support for LGBTQ rights. It's as, you know, the people that are in this room are probably 100% committed to LGBTQ rights and are taking action regularly. And then there's the people that are on the other end who are calling their state legislators and saying things like, you know, we need to double down on all these healthcare bans and ways that we can make schools less of a place of belonging for LGBTQ folks. But then there are really some people who are genuinely in the middle and genuinely confused and conflicted about these issues, and they really don't know what to believe from both sides. And so I would really encourage the people on this call, if you have anybody like that in your own life, to work to reframe, to talk about why the misinformation is incorrect, and to share stories, personal stories that relate to values that we all should share, in order to move them to a place of more support. Um, so some tips, or I borrowed this from another presentation about Project 2025, but sometimes we get too wrapped up in the process of passing a policy, and we don't necessarily talk about how that's going to hit home for regular people. So, for example, if you were talking about the Project 2025 plan, or to restrict LGBTQ rights, you might say something like Trump's Project 2025 would hurt my trans friends and family by denying them medically necessary and life-saving healthcare. So stuff like that, rather than the firing and hiring of civil servants and loyalty tests and all of that. That's important, but that doesn't hit home to someone's actual life or the lives of people that they care about quite as much. Sometimes we get really wonky in this policy space and use acronyms and legal terms. So it's really important that we use plain language and we define terms when it's needed. So, or not assuming that people know what our 2018 non-discrimination law is. So we might say things like, in New Hampshire in 2018, we updated our statewide non-discrimination law to protect trans people from employment and from non-discrimination in employment, housing, and public spaces. Now, Trump's Project 2025 would seek to erase those protections. And then finally, telling stories that bring the concept home. So, people are persuaded by stories that change their hearts and minds. So, I was reading an article about a teacher in Kentucky who told students who were bullying a classmate for having two moms, here all families are treated with respect. Should be pretty non-controversial, but she was reprimanded by school administration for quote unquote talking about gender in a way that quote infringed on the choices of the bullies' families. So when you can actually say how that uh, um, policy impacts a real situation in a classroom, that's more powerful than just saying the name of the policy itself. I've included some language that our opposition uses regularly when they are talking about transgender people. It is never necessary to repeat what they are saying. They like to increasingly say that this is ideology, which is a heady concept, abstract, lives up here, and doesn't actually connect to people's real lives. But of course, yes, it does. And so we need to remind people that this is about queer and trans people's actual lives. Um, we need to remind people that this is about all families, including LGBTQ families, and cutting off funding for best practice medically necessary healthcare. So some action steps, and I'll drop some more things in the chat. 603 Equality will be continuing to put out action steps to email and call state legislators about bills that would harm LGBTQ plus people. We want everyone to be really broadening their their network of action takers, especially locally. Or not just you calling your state rep who may or may not vote the right way, but asking and 3 or 5 friends or family to do the same. That's going to make a difference over time. And then finally, providing mutual aid for trans people in need. So there's trans people that are considering moving to states with more explicit protections for healthcare, and feel really alone in having to figure that out, often on a really tight budget. And so there are going to be more people that need aid, or more funds to make ends meet, or travel help to maybe going to Vermont or Maine for healthcare in the coming year. And so looking to connect people, or with folks that can give them rides, just brainstorm creatively, and get them what they need eventually. Um, or here's my emails. You can reach out to me with any questions, and then I'll also drop our link tree in the chat where you can sign up for 603 Equality emails, find our social media, donate, and then we'll be putting calls to actions on our link tree regularly so that people can see what the most urgent action is in terms of reaching their state rep. And then also wanted to let folks know about the Queer Care Fund that's available. That funds 100% of gender affirming care at the Lovering Health Center on the Seacoast in Greenland, not too far from UNH, and then also the Equality Health Center in Concord, New Hampshire. Anyone in need can go to either of those places and have care funded at 100%. So thank you so much, and happy to move into more Q&A.
Thank you so much, Linz, and for fighting through your cold to be able to share all that incredibly important information with us. And again, you just mentioned the Q&A. I'm inviting everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A. You don't have to wait until the end of the panel. So shifting back to Jordan, for the next question. Linz has, just talked about a lot of policies and potential ramifications of the election and upcoming legislative session. What kinds of things do you think are most kind of top of mind as far as concerns of queer college students at UNH these days, related to, post-secondary education?
Thank you. I would say that there's a lot of different concerns, both for me and other LGBTQ plus students. A lot of the concerns have been ramping up in like intensity, especially as the election started coming up, and particularly as the Republican Party started discussing things like defunding or dismantling the Department of Education, and specifically targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at universities. Are some of the policies that would be more intensely directed towards secondary education, post-secondary education. In particular, with the Department of Education, this is something that's directly referred to in Project 2025. And while it's not directly stated by name in the Trump agenda, Trump's political agenda on his website, he has also discussed policies similar to this. Some of the ramifications for that, for students in general, would be funding aid and stuff to be able to go to college in the first place is super important, especially for minorities in general and LGBTQ plus students. That aid is sometimes very important in order to get access to college education. But in particular, targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at colleges. These are programs that are often very vital for students, especially college students. At UNH, we are very fortunate to have the Beauregard Center, which is kind of our version of this at UNH, which targets a bunch of different minority groups, racial, religious, and LGBTQ plus students. And it's a place where you can get confidential counseling. You can learn about different groups of people. And it's also just a place to be able to hang out and understand that you're in a safe area. Which I know from both me and other LGBTQ plus students is a very important resource to have on campus, especially in a state where a lot of people tend to lean a lot more Republican. It can be very comforting to know that you have a space in which everybody is going to be able to accept you in general. And also the Beauregard Center is a very critical area for students who might not have the education that other students might have, especially relating to LGBTQ plus identities. So in targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at universities, it would lower access for students to have safe spaces where they know they can be themselves, which is going to negatively impact mental health. Again, going back to that statistic of lowering attempted suicides just by having and accepting space for students is a massive resource. But it's also going to lower things like safe sex education for LGBTQ plus students, which is critical, especially when you're coming into college. It's going to lower education about LGBTQ plus identities. College is a big space where people tend to learn more about themselves and about their identities. So that's a very important resource. Another very important role of the Department of Education and of diversity, equity, inclusion groups is dealing with bias incidents on college campuses. Not everybody's going to agree with the way certain people live. Not everybody's going to understand that you don't necessarily choose to be trans. And unfortunately, some students aren't going to really deal with that the correct way. And especially in an election year, I feel that I've personally seen a huge increase, especially after the election, in bias incidents, particularly of more right-leaning students explicitly calling people the F slur on campus or writing that on people's whiteboards and things like that, just being more bold with things like that. And these are incidences that are usually dealt with by the university with the laws that are enforced by the Department of Education and are fought against with diversity, equity, and inclusion groups. So another big concern is the university and universities across the country not being able to enforce non-bias like incidences on campus, meaning that there would be an increase in students being called the F slur or even more violent actions against LGBTQ plus students on campus. So one of the big concerns is both a decrease of resources on campus for students to be able to be themselves safely and an increase of more hostile actions towards LGBTQ plus students. One of the things I do notice with my peers and I is that it's very difficult to particularly pin down certain policies, especially from the Trump administration. There's a lot of things that are said in passing that seem completely outlandish and not necessarily possible, and you don't know how serious those policies are and maybe they're not written down somewhere and you don't know. Also, the difference between the Trump explicit policy on the Trump.com website, which is explicitly what he said he wants to do when he comes into office again, versus Project 2025, and being able to know the difference, if there even is a difference and stuff like that. Having read both of them, both the list of policies on Trump's website and Project 2025, also known as the Mandate for Leadership in its entirety. It's a lot to read. Trump is oddly enough kind enough to make his 16 pages. It's just on his website, but the Mandate to Leadership is, I believe, over 400 pages. I think it's like, I don't remember. I think it might be 500-600 pages. So it's very difficult to be able to pin down which specific policies might be coming towards you in a specific area. And it's very difficult to know how feasible those are. In New Hampshire, we are very lucky to be adjacent to Massachusetts, which is a sanctuary state, especially for trans people. But not all university students are lucky enough to be in that situation. Going back to that Trevor Project survey, a lot of trans, in particular, people and their families have had to consider moving to completely different parts of the country in fear of these policies affecting them and their education and their safety. Specifically, about 45% of trans youth families have had to consider moving, and about 39% of LGBTQ plus in general. Which is also just going to cause general instability for LGBTQ plus students, which is going to make it significantly more difficult to be able to focus on education in general. But a lot of the main things that are worries specifically in universities are the rollback of inclusion opportunities on campus and an increase of hostility towards LGBTQ plus students. We could talk for days about how this affects more high school students and how there's been a worry of a lot of these policies starting off affecting high school students and then they're getting more extreme affecting college and university students. But it is extremely difficult to particularly pin down these things, especially because it changes so much depending on what part of the country you're in. But those are the main concerns.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for that really kind of comprehensive look at what uh, current college students are kind of thinking and dealing with. And especially, I think the thing that jumped out at me the most is kind of how this all of this going on might impact kind of your ability to focus on your studies and on that kind of day-to-day pressure, which is an additional burden at this time. Shifting back to Michael, I wonder if there's anything you would like to add kind of at a federal level related to policies or kind of predictions of what might be coming down the road, uh, whether related to the Trump agenda or Project 2025 or things that you're hearing kind of on the ground from communities in DC.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to predict anything that the incoming president is going to do. I think his track record of chaos and all of that speaks for itself. So I'm not going to get into what he's going to be doing or not, but I will say that, again, going back to what Jordan said, there's certainly a lot of concern here in Washington among activists and folks who were LGBTQ and or allies, or even those folks who work in the federal government about what's coming down the pike. There's definitely a lot of concern around Project 2025, as Jordan just so eloquently said. For me, the biggest concern that I have, just as somebody who follows these things, is what is the incoming administration going to do that will particularly harm transgender folks and LGBTQ immigrants and migrants. The previous Trump administration targeted these folks quite badly, and there's nothing that indicates that they're not going to try to do that again. So that's one thing that I'm particularly concerned about. I do also, however, like to look at some bright spots from the election, and there are some. We do have a transgender woman who will be going into Congress in January, Sarah McBride from Delaware. That's a huge step forward for trans folks in the LGBTQ community at large. So I think we need to celebrate that. Um, all of the openly lesbian and gay members of Congress, including Congressman Chris Pappas from New Hampshire, were reelected. So that's also another positive thing to look at. So yes, the situation is quite concerning. There's a lot of folks who are very scared about what's coming down the pike from the second Trump administration. But I think, again, it's important that there are some bright spots. Another bright spot here in the DC area is that she's not openly part of the community, but Angela also Brooks is the first Black woman elected to represent Maryland in the US Senate. That's a huge step forward for progress and representation in this country. And then Lisa Blunt Rochester from Delaware is also a Black woman who was elected to the US Senate. So we have to kind of, it's horrible what happened on election day, but there are bright spots. And I just wanted to one thing that I really took note of, and it's something that I remember having discussions about at UNH 20 plus years ago when I was on, I think it was called the LGBTQ President's Commission on LGBTQ issues. I forget. I'm not sure what it's called now, but this was 20, 25 years ago. One of the things that I often would ask as somebody who grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire, is that how do we talk with folks who they're not bad people, they just don't understand perhaps the complexities of LGBTQ issues? How do we talk with these folks about why the things that we're advocating for and why this is important? How do we, for lack of a better way to describe it, how do we convince these folks that what we're doing is important and you should support this? So I took real interest in what Lynn's was just talking about in terms of how do we talk with folks in the middle. I think that's more important now than ever. We often in Washington get caught up in the policy debates and the wonkiness and which agency's doing what, who said what. That's important. But if you're sitting in Manchester, New Hampshire, you're probably not going to care too much about that. You just want to know what's going to happen to protect my trans child, or what's going to happen to ensure that my marriage to my husband or my wife or my spouse is going to be protected. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done to, maybe improve messaging a little bit in terms of how do we move that movable middle. So thank you, Linz, for bringing that up. I think that's really important. That's more important now than ever. And, perhaps policymakers can keep that in mind as well. But that's kind of my thoughts from here in Washington.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who is in the audience for the questions and comments that you've been adding to the Q&A. I think it makes sense at this point to kind of jump into some of the questions that are in the Q&A. Lots of people, first of all, are thanking you all for being part of this and for having this webinar at this time. And folks are also asking specific questions about kind of resources and next steps. So I'm happy to direct this to people specifically. Maybe I'll ask Lynn's to jump in first about the question about kind of how people can most make a difference in New Hampshire and have an impact kind of locally when there are so many issues nationally that might feel out of control. And I'll tie that to another question from the Q&A, which is specifically about combating misinformation, and if you have specific tips about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot, but I'll try to be concise and roll it all into one. So I think that in the new year, New Hampshire's legislative session runs from January to June. or so. Once we start in June, we'll have or some Zoom sessions on how do you understand the New Hampshire General Court website. I'll drop that website in the chat for everyone. But on that site, you can look up when bills are being heard. There's also a um, page where you can register your opinion for or against the bill and upload a copy of virtual testimony if you do not or have the means to go to Concord in the middle of the day. I know that's a big barrier for folks. Or for a brief moment during COVID, we had Zoom testimony, which was great, but we don't have that anymore, unfortunately. So we will I would encourage people to just start now by looking up who is your state rep and reaching out to them and saying, "Hi, I'm somebody who's really concerned about LGBTQ rights, equality, justice, safety in the Granite State," and see what they have to say about that. On a lot of this call, we know that a lot of the opposition to our rights and safety is coming from one party, but last year, when the House was almost completely evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, we really, and when I say we, I mean the coalition of organizations that are working in an advocacy space, or we, I think, really underestimated how much education we had to do for some Democrats as well. There were some people that we assumed or knew the right way to vote and to stand with us. And unfortunately, we did lose some of them on some pretty important votes early about a year ago. And so it's really important that we just check all of those assumptions at the door and go back to just basic story sharing and why we care about this on a human level. And I would also encourage people to go a step further and to research a little bit of who your state rep or state senator is. What do they care about? What other issues as are they working on? Where might you have some genuine overlap that maybe you're a little bit surprised to find? Or do you have the same school that you went to? Or do you have another community connection, somebody who owns a local business or something? Like those elements of figuring out who your people are and who their people are. Sometimes we refer to that as power mapping. Sometimes that can be really a persuasive. For example, when we were working on the non-discrimination bill in 2017, where there was a trans girl who went to the same high school as one of the sort of in the middle reps on the committee, and he was really persuaded by her personal story and was the key vote to get a positive recommendation from that committee. And so the more we learn about each other and the more that we work to find that common ground, or the better off we are in the long term. And I'll also mention just another silver lining. I think in this upcoming odd number year, we have local elections. Those can be really important for running for positions like school board in your town, that can have of a lot of power in terms of protecting LGBTQ students and really all marginalized or vulnerable students. So considering running for school board or another local position, or encouraging a friend who you think would be really good in that position to run and knocking doors for them, helping them out, can be a big way to make a difference locally in a district where you need fewer votes than a larger statewide or position. I noticed somebody in the chat had asked a question about or the sports ban. What is physical evidence? And actually, that is never defined in the bill, which makes us extra concerned that that could lead to, quite frankly, genital inspections of minor children, which is extremely creepy and disturbing. And so that has not yet been put to a test. But the good news is, in the meantime, school boards are making proactive decisions to side with federal law that has allowed transgender athletes to continue playing. So the ACLU and GLAD law are have sued the state over the sports ban, and there are 2 young trans athletes that they are representing, and they're asking this judge who ruled at first that the state ban is likely unconstitutional. The lawyers are asking that state judge to make the ruling so that all transgender girls can play, and not just the 2 that are moving forward with the lawsuit. So we have had school districts vote to do the right thing, but that's going to be an ongoing process. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Linz, and for picking up that additional answer in the Q and to the question in the Q&A. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A that are related to kind of other issues kind of outside the Department of Education. What other kind of administrative agencies might be particularly poised to impact upcoming impact LGBTQ plus people's lives through upcoming legislation, and also a question about what is the best place for a mental health professional who has an increasing number of trans clients to access resources that they can provide for these clients through particularly in the medical area. I know, Linz, you mentioned the Lovering Center in Greenland. Jordan, there was also a question about counseling, and you'd mentioned the Beauregard Center. There's also the psychological and counseling services at UNH. I don't know if there are other things. We only have a few minutes left, but other things you wanted to mention as far as resources for medical health or other agencies that might be impacting upcoming decisions.
Yeah, I just dropped in the chat. The Gender Diverse Care Coalition is a group of gender affirming care providers in New Hampshire, and they're sharing resources with any therapists, counselors that work with trans clients. So I've learned a lot from them and would recommend getting involved with them.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that resource. One of the, I think, last question, I'll just reiterate the question about other agencies that come to mind.
Personally, in reading the mandate for leadership, the big one does tend to be the Department of Education, but other ones, like the Department of Health and Human Services, particularly in concerns about access to transgender healthcare, meaning hormone blockers, hormone replacement therapy, gender reassignment surgery, things like that, is a huge concern. That's one of the other massive ones. Not as huge of a concern, but does come up in the mandate for leadership a couple of times, is the Department of Labor, particularly, and how that relates to labor discrimination protections for LGBTQ plus students. For example, discriminatory hiring practices or discrimination in the workplace as it relates to LGBTQ plus people. It is, again, really difficult to say because President-elect Trump doesn't tend to really go very in depth about a lot of the policies he brings up. But if I were to talk about other departments in particular, I would say the big 3 are the Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Labor.
And I would
Personally.
also quickly add the Justice Department, perhaps, enforcing federal hate crimes laws, and then, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for the really great additions to the in-depth Department of Education information you shared earlier. Before we end today, I wanted to introduce everyone to Larry Meacham, if you don't already know Larry. And Larry, would you be able to say a few words about the Alum Affinity Group?
Absolutely. And thank you, Holly, and all the panelists on today's discussion. This is the first of additional webinars we're hoping as an affinity group to have in the future, along with other opportunities, inclusive of an opportunity to get together in June for a reunion and any other type of efforts that people would want to see. We've established the affinity group to basically provide for a means for not only alumni, but allies, faculty, soon to graduate students, a way with which we can stay included and help each other out. I think one thing that was said on today's call that really defines our affinity group, and it's the ability to hold each other closer. And I think that is really what we are trying to attempt. We've also built a Facebook presence, Facebook group page. And again, if anyone is interested in joining that or has additional questions, by all means, and with the notes that are sent out, my email address will be included, and do not hesitate to reach out to me. And lastly, and equally as important, we've established the Inside Out Alumni Fund. And it basically is to support, and I'm reading from it just so I make sure I define it as accurately as possible, to support the Office of Community, Equity, and Diversity in championing LGBTQIA plus issues, fostering individual and community growth, and building an inclusive and equitable environment throughout the UNH community. So when they do have the 603 challenge, or you have the means with which to donate now, we do encourage you to donate to the fund. So with that, Holly, thank you, and thanks to the board members who have done a great deal of work on this, especially Jim Huddleston and Richard Maxfield, as well as to the other board members. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, for that introduction about the affinity group and the fund. Thanks also to Jim and Rich, to Karina Gaines from Alumni Relations, to everyone who's attended, and to our three panelists. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. And we look forward, as Larry said, to continuing the conversation in future webinars, and hopefully seeing each other in person at future events on campus. So closing, I think, again, with what Lynn's shared about holding each other close, figuring out how to support each other, and how to kind of support ourselves for the work that's ahead. And I think a lot of that in this webinar today, kind of the connections that we're making across generations of alums and folks at UNH and beyond UNH. Thanks, Larry, for your leadership in putting this together, and for everyone who helped make it possible. And everyone will be receiving a follow-up email. So hopefully some of the links, if you weren't able to get them from the chat, you will receive through email, and can also reach out to me. I'm going to be easy to find on the UNH website, and I can help put you in touch with anyone that you'd like to be in touch with if you need to connect later. Thank you so much, everybody.